Here you see our big department. It's a lovely place. Do you see it? We have a lake in front. And these are all the colleagues. It's a huge department and a lot of knowledge here. And this is what I said is Professor Traupe. And you see he with his students here and many colleagues from all over the world, he made the new classification on inherited ichthyosis. Yeah, this was already 14 years ago. And Judith Fisher is the expert on these molecular analysis, and she found many new genes and incredible what they work. And the important thing is in genodermatosis, but also maybe in melanoma and so on, you have to integrate everything, the history, the clinical findings, ultrastructure, histology, and the genetic stuff. And this is the way I work. And this is what I learned from the clinicians. The clinicians also see patterns. And when they talk about palmoplantar keratoderma, or palmoplantar keratosis, they say, well, it may be a diffuse keratosis on hands and foot, yeah. Sometimes blistering, so they really lose their horny layer on the foot here. It may be circumscribed in a linear fashion or in an areata fashion. It may be punctate or spiny, like here. Sometimes it's diffuse and transgradients, but it's also written many names, but actually it does not help you for the clinical differential diagnosis so much. The important thing is some of them are syndromic, and some of them may die of this keratosis. I will explain you later.
So different
yeah.
That category of what was it?
Gradients.
Transgradient. Yeah. That means that it goes on the surface,
it goes over the edge here to the back of the hands and the foot. Yeah, this is transgradients. But don't pay too much attention to it because there are so many exceptions and variations. So actually it turned out not to be helpful. Yeah. Okay. Now, actually, I must say, except 2 or 3 examples I will bring today, all the other diseases are fully clarified genetically. It's wonderful, yeah? So not so much left to discover. Much is published, what I'm talking about, by Traupe in Rook's textbook. And I wrote the chapter, actually it's the first chapter in McKee's pathology, conification disorder, where I write about ichthyosis, keratodermas, porokeratosis, and so on. And also in the Bologna book, maybe some of you may use the Bologna book. Many clinicians do. It's a wonderful book with many good clinical pictures and many schemes and tables. And these are my 6 boxes I will now present you. Yeah. Here you have in the handout, you will have the clinical patterns with all the differential diagnosis, and then the 6 histologic patterns. And I must say, I also use it when I get cases for consultation. Very often I have to use my own tables because you cannot remember everything here.
So that's a good news for everybody.
No, it's impossible. Even when I give a lecture on that, I always have to prepare a weekend before I start reading again. Yes. They are so rare. Some of them are really rare, but they do exist. The patients do exist. And interestingly, it takes a long time until they get a diagnosis, sometimes decades. Yeah. And so we start with these diffuse forms of palmoplantar keratoderma. And this is the most common means 1 to 100,000 is the incidence, yeah? And then there are diffuse forms with associated symptoms. And then you have diffuse form associated with ichthyosis or epidermal bullosa simplex, yeah? So we start with this Unatost Förner, and it's the most common type, and it's a keratin mutation, 1 or 9. Interestingly, you must know that on volar skin, you do not express keratin 10. Keratin 10 only is on the integument. This means if you have an ichthyosis with a keratin 1 mutation, very often this ichthyosis also shows palmoplantar keratoderma. But when you have an ichthyosis with keratin 10 mutation, you will not manifest palmoplantar keratoderma because here only keratin 9 is expressed. Yeah. So I will show you the clinical picture. And then why is it important? Because these patients get painful blisters, in particular when you want to treat the keratosis with retinoids. And then the patients will not be very happy because they get blisters, they lose their horny layer, and then it starts to get painful. Yeah. And this is the clinical picture. You see this diffuse form, sometimes waxy. After a blister, you lose your shoes. Yeah. And this is what is called transgradients. But this is not so important, but just to give you an impression. And this is the histology. The histology, it's epidermolytic hyperkeratosis. Why do you know this? Because it's an incidental finding. Although you see it almost daily when you read basal cell carcinoma or nevi, aside, you have sometimes a small focus with this pattern of epidermolytic hyperkeratosis. And although you may know acanthosis, acantoma presenting with epidermolytic hyperkeratosis. And I will show this to you. So I will show you the original slide because it's an important pattern. And you see this mighty hyperkeratosis. Yeah. So this is on volar skin. And normally you don't have that hyperkeratosis, but be careful, you cannot quantify. Yeah. So when you have a biopsy from a worker, someone who works with his hands, of course you have a mighty hyperkeratosis. I don't have a mighty hyperkeratosis. Yeah. So it's difficult to quantify. So you depend on the clinician. Yeah. And what you see here is first, there's not so much inflammation here. And you see these vacuoles here. And in the textbooks, it says it's ballooning, cytolysis, curious terms. But this is not the diagnosis. The diagnosis is here. Do you see these hypereosinophilic areas around the nucleus? Because this is a keratin mutation. And once you have a keratin mutation, look for this material here. And the other parts of the cytoplasm, they are very pale. Now, and then, of course, you get small vacuoles and clefting, not big bullae or so, yeah? And of course, the keratohyalin granules are crumbly, yeah? They are coarse. Why? Because if the keratin skeleton is not intact anymore, you don't have the profilagrin cannot aggregate in a regular manner, yeah? So once the keratin skeleton collapses, also the keratohyalin granules will get irregular. So this is logic. And then you get autohyperkeratosis. Yeah, this is the thing you see in, this is what the pattern is, epidermolytic hyperkeratosis. And the diagnosis are these hypereosinophilic globules here, aside or sometimes around the nucleus here. Why is it hypereosinophilic? Only keratin takes up eosin. Yeah, this means this is the ultrastructure made of this case. Here you see the clumps of keratin. There is no keratin skeleton anymore. And in the areas where there's no keratin, it seems to be that it's empty. It is empty. There are only ribosomes, mitochondria, and they do not take up eosin. So these are the pale areas here. Yeah. And then you see the irregular keratohyalin. Yeah. Precipitating along these clumps of keratin. And of course you get clefting because the desmosomes will not work anymore. And then, of course, you split off the horny layer. Okay. And this is true also for the incidental findings. This is true for acantoma, yeah, acantoma of epidermolytic hyperkeratotic type or in ichthyosis broad, yeah. And this pattern is very specific for Unatost Förner or a greater epidermolytic variant, but take Unatost Förner. So actually, this first box is very easy. Once you see it, you see the pattern, you may conclude on a keratin mutation, and then you end up with PPK Unatost Förner. This pattern is non-epidermolytic, and you see it's boring. You only see autohyperkeratosis and nothing else. Yeah, and this is a difficult box because you have so many possibilities histologically. Yeah. And this is the most worst box. When you get this, you really depend on the clinician. Yeah. I will show you multimeleda. We know the mutation. It's a ligand of this acetylcholine receptor. And I will show you the clinical pictures. Superimposed, you may find malignancies, melanoma and Bowen. This is also interesting. But you also see for the first time, you also have nail dystrophy. You have oral leukokeratosis. This means many palmoplantar keratosis, some of them may have associated features. And this is the clinical picture.
So we'll stay in diffuse. We're still
we stay in diffuse. You see this diffuse pattern, and it's highly macerated and it's smelly because you have hyperhidrosis, you have overgrowth of bacteria or hyphae, and it's a very unpleasant smell and very transgradient. This means you also have it on the dorsum of the hands, and you have nail changes. But to be honest, Professor Traupe, I mean, he immediately made it came in for me as multimeleda, yeah? And just of interest, he wanted to have a biopsy, yeah? He said he wanted to rule out epidermolytic hyperkeratotic type. Because when I say, well, it's not epidermolytic hyperkeratotic, so I can say it's not keratin mutation. And then he says, thank you. This is the only differential diagnosis clinically, Untertost Förner. I have ruled it out, so it's multimeleda, yeah? And I show you the histology. The histology is also a bit boring. Apart in the few cases I have seen, it's a lot of papillomatosis here. But again, autohyperkeratosis, normal stratum granulosum, and no vacuolization here in the epidermis. You see this? Pretty boring here. Once you have papillomatosis, you always get dilated vessels like in psoriasis or in verruca vulgaris. This is not specific for psoriasis, verruca vulgaris, and other diseases. Whenever you have papillomatosis, when the papillary body goes up here to the surface, yeah, you get these dilated vessels. This is just a small remark. Always make PAs. You see, you don't have any inflammation here, no parakeratosis, no neutrophils, only a few lymphocytes, but still a lot of hyphae here. Hyphae like dermatophytes, like the horny layer, yeah.